Hello. So today we're going to be talking about double object pronouns in Spanish. In other words, we're going to be talking about replacing direct and indirect objects in the same sentence, okay? So if you are watching this video, I'm going to assume that you already know what a direct object is, as well as what an indirect object is, right? So yes, but I'm going to do a brief recap. So the direct object is going to respond to the question of who or what receives the action. So to identify it, we look at the verb in the sentence and we ask ourselves who or what receives the action. For the indirect object, we ask ourselves the question of to whom or what, or for whom or what an action is done. Okay, and that's going to give us the indirect object, and the indirect object receives the direct object. So in order for there to be an indirect object, you need to have a direct object, of course. Okay, so that's just a brief recap of direct and indirect objects, right? And I'm sure you will be familiar with the direct and indirect object pronouns, right? They're pretty much the same with the exception of the third person, right? And of course the meanings will be different, but other than the third person, they're all the same, right? So we're going to see how we replace them both when they appear in a sentence together, right? How do we replace the direct and indirect objects with direct and indirect object pronouns, right? We're going to see that. Okay, so let's go. So when we want to replace both the direct and indirect object in a sentence with their corresponding object pronouns, there are two important details to note, right? So there are two important details that you need to pay attention to, right? One, the indirect object pronoun is placed before the direct object pronoun, right? So rule number one, the indirect object always comes first, right? That's always going to come first, right? However, if the indirect object is the third person singular or plural, which is le or les, then it changes to se. So two rules you have to remember. One, the indirect object pronoun is going to go first. And if the indirect object pronoun is the third person, then you have to change it to se. Doesn't matter if it's singular or plural. Okay? So those are two rules that you have to know when it comes to replacing both the direct and the indirect object, right, with their corresponding object pronouns, right? So you would see if you're replacing both of them, then of course this is going to shorten the language dramatically, right? Which is what you're using them for, right? But let's see some examples at play, right? So compré las flores para Ana. I bought flowers for Anna. So the first thing we need to do is that we need to identify our direct object. And remember, our direct object is going to be who or what receives the action. So in this case, compré las flores. So what did I buy? Las flores. So that's our direct object. For whom? Para Ana. So Ana is our indirect object because Ana is the one receiving the direct object. Okay? So now that we've identified them, now it's time to replace them. So las flores is that would be plural and feminine, so the appropriate direct object pronoun would be las. Para Ana, that's third person singular, so the appropriate indirect object pronoun would be le. Okay, so we need to remember the rule now. Remember, the indirect object goes before the direct object pronoun, right? So we wouldn't say le las compré. No, we wouldn't say that. Le las compré. No. Remember, because it is the indirect object is the third person, it changes to se. So, se las compré. I bought them for her. Right? So you see, the indirect is going to change to se, and then it will be followed by the direct, which is las. And the next part, we are going to go through the placement, right? But this is just an introduction, right? So don't be intimidated, because we are going to look at placement next, right? But like I said, this is just an introduction. So, se las compré. I bought them for her. Okay? 2. Ella no quiere contar la historia a sus padres. She does not want to tell her parents the story. Okay, we identify our direct object. What does she not want to tell? La historia. That's our direct object. To whom? A sus padres. Right? Because the parents are going to be the recipient of the direct object. Right? So, la historia is singular and feminine, so the direct object pronoun that will correspond to that would be la. And a sus padres, that is third person plural, so the appropriate indirect object pronoun would be les. And once again, we need to remember the rule. The indirect comes first, and if the indirect is the third person, then it changes to se once again. So when we replace them both, you would have ella no quiere contársela, which means that she does not want to tell it to them. It being the story, and to them obviously being the parents, right? So this would be an introduction to replacing both the direct and the indirect object in a sentence, right? Now, you would notice that the placement is pretty similar, because you see here the placement is before the conjugated verb, and then here the placement occurs attached to the infinitive. But once again, this is what we're going to proceed to. Okay? So next part, we're going to be dealing with the placement of the direct and the indirect object pronouns in the sentence. Alright, so we move on to placement. And as you know, we would have briefly seen where they appear in a sentence from the introduction. And those places would be before the conjugated verb and attached to the infinitive, right? But now we're going to focus on placement exclusively, right? So the first place, and before you get into that, you would realize that the placements are very similar to the direct and indirect object pronouns placement, right? You would realize that the placements are very similar to those, right? So yes, the first place that these can occur would be before the conjugated verb, okay? So, di el dinero a Mariana. I gave the money to Mariana, right? So, what is our direct object? El dinero, which is what I give. So that would be lo, because that's singular and masculine. To whom? A Mariana. So that's le. And of course, because it is the third person, it changes to se. Okay, so it will be se lo di. Right? Se lo di. I gave it to her. And the same rule applies as far as clarification. If you do not know, if the indirect object is unclear, then we need to put it at the end. So in this case, it will be se lo di a Mariana, so that there is no confusion as to who is the indirect object, right? 2. Attached to the infinitive. Quiero comprar una casa para ti. I want to buy a house for you. So we identify our direct object. What is it that I want to buy? Una casa. That's singular and feminine, so that would be la. For whom? Para ti. For you. So for you, you would be the indirect object, and that would be te. Alright? And when we are attaching these to the infinitive, they become one word. So they're not two words like you see here before the conjugated verb, right? So, quiero comprártela, right? I want to buy it for you. So, when you attach these to the infinitive, you have to put an accent on the fourth vowel from the end. So, 1, 2, 3, no, sorry, 1, 2, not the fourth vowel, sorry, the third vowel. So, 1, 2, 3, accent. Quiero comprártela. Okay? So you have to put an accent on the third vowel from the end. Right? And I could also say te la quiero comprar. Same thing. I could put it before the conjugated verb, or I could put it attached to the infinitive. But once I put them attached to the infinitive, you have to put an accent on the third vowel from the end. Right? So yes. 3. Attached to the gerund. Estoy diciendo la verdad a Susana. What am I saying? La verdad. That's our direct object. The truth. To whom? A Susana. So that is, so Susana is our indirect object, right? And that's the third person, so that would be singular, so that would be le, and that will of course change to se. So, estoy diciéndosela, I am telling it to her, right? So when we attach these to the gerund, we have to put an accent on the fourth vowel from the end. So 1, 2, 3, 4, accent. And we can also say, se la estoy diciendo. Perfectly fine. It's the same thing as saying, estoy diciendo se la. But if I put these attached to the gerund, then I must remember to put an accent on the fourth vowel from the end, right? And 4, attached to the affirmative command. So, manda un email a mí. What to send? Un email, which is singular and masculine. So that would be lo. To whom? To me. So, me. Right? That would be the indirect object. Okay? And so once we attach these object pronouns to the affirmative command, we have to remember, if it is 3 syllables, then the third vowel from the end would have an accent. But if it's 4, the fourth vowel would have an accent, right? So in this case, you have mandamelo, that's 4. So the fourth from last vowel needs to have an accent. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes. Mandamelo. Send it to me. Okay. If I wanted to make this negative, I would say no me lo mandes. Right? Because, of course, the indirect object pronoun has to come first, which is me. So no me lo mandes. And then, so no me would be the indirect, lo would be the direct, and then of course you would have to put in negative, so mandes, right? So that's how you would make this negative. Just like here, to make this negative, you would say no se lo di. I did not give it to her, right? So yes, these are pretty much the rules as far as placement goes, right? So now we are going to proceed to 2 quizzes actually. The first quiz is going to test your knowledge of replacing both the direct and the indirect object in a sentence. And then the second test is going to test your ability to choose the right one. And of course, you would have to choose whether the direct object pronoun or the indirect object pronoun should be applied, right? So let's get to it. So we proceed to quiz 1. And as previously mentioned, this quiz is going to test your knowledge of how to use both direct and indirect objects together, right? Or object pronouns together. So we place the direct and indirect object with their corresponding object pronouns, okay? So compraste una naranja para mí, okay? So this means, this is the question, did you buy an orange for me? So let's identify our direct object. Our direct object is going to be what did you buy? So una naranja is going to be our direct, right? That's going to be our direct. So direct. For whom? Para mí is going to be our indirect, right? And you know the direct object pronoun that will correspond to this would be la, because it's singular and feminine, and the indirect object that would apply to para mí would be me. Okay, so that would be it. So let me just translate. So did you buy an orange for me, right? So of course, when the only place that these can occur would be before the conjugated verb. So you know the indirect comes first. So me, and it's a question. So me la compraste, right? Me la compraste, right? That would be the answer. Did you buy it for me? Yeah, did you buy it for me? Me la compraste. 2. Voy a contar la historia a mis amigos. Okay, I'm going to tell the story to my friends, or I'm going to tell my friends the story. So what am I going to tell? La historia. So this is our direct. Okay, this is our direct. To whom? To my friends. So a mis amigos, that's indirect, right? So I am going to tell the story to my friends, right? And because the historia is singular and feminine, it would be la, and a mis amigos would be plural and the third person, so it would be les. And remember, les, the third person would change to se, right? So there are 2 places that these can occur, right? Because you have an infinitive. So let's go. So we are going to put it before the conjugated verb first. So se la voy a contar. That's the first place. Se la voy a contar. Or I could say voy a contar se la. And remember, if we have an infinitive, we have to put an accent on the third vowel from the end. So 1, 2, 3. Right. La. And this would mean I am going to tell it to them. I am going to tell it to them. Voy a contárselo, sela, or sela voy a contar. Number 3, explica la idea a tu hermana, right? So this is an affirmative command, of course. So explain the idea to your sister, right? So what to explain? La idea. So this is our direct. So this is direct. To whom? A tu hermana, to your sister. So this is indirect, right? And this is an affirmative command, so these will go attached to the affirmative command. So la idea, that's direct, so that would be la. And a tu hermana would be the third person singular, so that would be le. And of course that will change to se. So the answer here would be explícasela, right? And remember, when you are attaching these object pronouns to the affirmative, you have to put an accent on the vowel depending on how many syllables. So let's count. Explícasela, that's like 5, so it would be 4, right? On the fourth vowel. So 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So explícasela, right? So yeah, if it's 3, it would be on the third, but if it's 4 or more, it would be on the fourth, right? So explícasela, explain it to her. Okay, so yes, these are the answers for the first quiz, and let us proceed to the second. Okay, so we move on to quiz 2, and once again, this is going to test your ability to determine whether the direct or the indirect object pronoun should be used, right? So number 1, I want to tell her, right? So obviously her would be the object, but we have to determine whether her would be direct or indirect, right? So the verb to tell would be contar or decir, depending on which one you want to use, but let's use contar. So to tell, what to tell would be our direct. So whatever is you tell would be the direct. To whom would be the indirect, right? So the person who is receiving whatever it is that you are telling is going to be the indirect object. And if you want to tell her, then you have to tell her something. Therefore, her would be indirect, right? And remember, when you have an infinitive, the indirect object pronoun can occur before the conjugated verb or attached to the infinitive, right? So these are the possibilities. Le quiero contar or quiero contarle. So once again, the direct object is implied here because you have to tell her something, right? 2, she will kill them. And I'm sure you're asking me, what is them? Or what are them, right? So them would be spiders. And if you don't know what spiders are in Spanish, it would be las arañas, right? So in order to determine whether spiders would be direct or indirect, we have to look at the verb. So the verb matar is to kill. So what will she kill? The spiders. Therefore, them would be direct because it's responding to the question of what receives the action. Arañas would be feminine and plural, so that would be las. And of course, there's only one place that the direct object can go in this case, and that would be before the conjugated verb, right? So the answer would be ella las matará, right? She will kill them. All right. 3, explain it. Once again, I'm sure you're asking me, what is it? It is going to be concept, right? And of course, this is an affirmative command, which would be the imperative. And those can change depending on who you're speaking to, right? So we're going to imagine that this is someone that we know. So we're going to use the familiar, right? What's the concept? In Spanish, concept would be el concepto, right? El concepto. So obviously it is the object, but would this be direct or indirect? Okay, so let's look at the verb explain, explicar. Whatever you explain is going to be direct, but to whom is going to be indirect. So if you explain a concept, then a concept would have to be direct because it is what you are explaining, right? Therefore, the answer here would be explícalo. And remember, when you attach the direct object pronoun to the affirmative command, you have to put an accent on the third vowel from the end. So 1, 2, 3, right? Explícalo, right? Because it's 3 syllables. No, it's 4 actually. Explícalo, right? 4. So it will be on the third vowel from the end. Because if it's 3 or more syllables, then it will be third vowel from the end, right? So explain it. Explícalo. And 4, ask him. And once again, it's a familiar command. So we're going to assume that we know this person that we're speaking to, right? The verb to ask would be preguntar, right? But him, we have to determine whether him is going to be direct or indirect. So let's look at the verb to ask, preguntar. You can't ask him directly. You have to ask him something, whether it's a question or whatever, right? So him would have to be the indirect, because you have to ask something to him or ask him something, right? So this is another case where the direct object is implied, right? So it's a command, so pregunta le. You attach it to the affirmative command. And once again, you have to remember if it's 3 or more syllables, then it would carry an accent on the third vowel from the end. So 1, 2, 3. Right. So pregúntale. Right? Alright, so these are the answers for this quiz. Alright, I hope that this was helpful. Gracias por ver y hasta la vista.